The Great Barrier Reef has a tropical climate and sits at a latitude of about 18 degrees south. Coral reefs in general are 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south. It sits at a 0-meter altitude, and the temperature averages anywhere from 30 to 21 degrees Celsius. The reef receives about 10 to 13 hours a day of sunlight, which is a lot, and it rains about 2,010 millimeters a year. It spans over 344,400 kilometers squared and has 300 species of coral and some varieties of mangrove in the northern Cays. Taking a look at the climatograph, you can see that the average temperature and rainfall drops around summertime and rises back up again during winter. Moving on to adaptations. Zooxanthellae, or algae. The coral polyps that make up reefs serve as hosts to zooxanthellae, which take shelter in their tissue. The zooxanthellae, via photosynthesis, are capable of transforming water and carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and oxygen. Sea anemone. Due to their lack of mobility and soft bodies, they would be an easy target for predators. However, adaptations such as their stinging tentacles act as a protective shield against predators. Angelfish. Angelfish have evolved adaptations such as a protracted jaw and the ability to secrete a thick coating of mucus around bits of sponge. These adaptations allow angelfish to utilize sponges, not often used by other reef fish, as their primary food source. Parrotfish. Parrotfish have a set of pharyngeal teeth that they use to grind up coral. This helps them reduce interspecies competition for food resources. Coral. Coral has an adaptation that helps them survive coral bleaching. They produce a sunblock called a fluorescent pigment. These pigments form a shield around zooxanthellae, and at high temperatures, they protect themselves from harmful effects of sunlight and UV rays. Organism interactions. Mutualism. Corals contain zooxanthellae that live in their tissue. The relationship between the algae and the coral polyp facilitates the recycling of nutrients in nutrient-poor tropical waters. Parasitism. Fish lice is known to remove the tongue of fish hosts by extracting blood and then acts as the fish's new tongue. Commensalism. Remora or suckerfish attach themselves to the skin of a larger marine animal via a specialized organ on their back. This organ allows them to travel with their host without harming them, collecting food particles from the host. Predation. Fish, marine worms, barnacles, crabs, snails, and sea stars all prey on the soft inner tissue of coral polyps. Competition. Spatial competition between elkhorn coral and staghorn coral. Community. Stone corals, octocorals, sponges, algae, etc. Niche. Coral provides shelter and spawning grounds to a wide variety of ocean life. They are also protection from waves and strong ocean currents.
This food web shows us the transformation from energy from animal to animal to animal in the Great Barrier Reef. This also brings us to the 10% rule. The 10% rule shows us that only 10% of the energy will be passed on from one trophic level to the next. All of these animals are working together and yet separately to create an ecosystem that will sustain itself. For example, the bull kelp might be eaten by the dugong, and then that dugong might be eaten by a tiger shark. Or a giant kelp might be eaten by an abalone, and that abalone might be eaten by an 11-armed sea star, and that 11-armed sea star might be eaten by a tiger shark. The different transformations in energy, and with each animal being able to eat different animals and having a variety, shows us that the Great Barrier Reef has a complex food web. Next slide. A trophic pyramid is a graphical representation showing the flow of energy from one trophic level to the next. It also shows us that with how wide the layers are, how much energy is held within those layers. So the primary consumers in this trophic pyramid shows phytoplankton, seagrass, and algae. They hold the most energy. As that energy is passed on, the 10% rule applies, and zooplankton take on 10% of the energy from phytoplankton or seagrass, and then the barjack or the yellowtail snapper will take on 10% of the energy from the zooplankton or the queen conch, and so on until you get up to the reef shark, which is the top predators, and the bluefin is also another top predator. Gross productivity in an ecosystem is the amount of carbon fixed during photosynthesis by the producers in the ecosystem. This would be phytoplankton and seagrass. However this is true, a lot of the energy harnessed in an ecosystem is used up by the processes of the producers, which would be respiration. The relative productivity of the Great Barrier Reef is extremely high. It's near the equator, next to the edges of landmass in Australia, shallow water as well, and it uses corals to give protection to a lot of fish, which causes it to have some of the highest biodiversity in the ocean. Corals have a mutualistic relationship with algae and other corals, and so that also helps to bring up the productivity. And also a main reason is because it is near the shallow end of the water, and so light can get in to affect the corals and affect the plants that are in the water. Carbon enters the ocean through the atmosphere-ocean transfer. After that, the marine biota intakes some of the carbon dioxide. Of that carbon dioxide, it's dissolved into organic carbon and is released into the deep ocean. Some of that carbon becomes sediments, and the other carbon is released back up into the surface of the ocean and is evaporated into the atmosphere to go through the carbon cycle again, somewhere where there might be land or there might be more ocean.
The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen exists in the atmosphere as N2 gas. In nitrogen fixation, bacteria converts N2 into ammonia, a form of nitrogen usable by plants. When animals eat the plants, they acquire usable nitrogen compounds. Nitrogenous sediment from the runoff falls to the ocean floor. Then it goes through a process of denitrification by bacteria to N2 and goes back up into the atmosphere.
Phosphorus enters the ocean and intakes in from plants. It is converted to organic phosphorus when inorganic. Then, after grazing and after the predation of animals, and after those animals decompose organic phosphorus, it converts into inorganic phosphorus by bacterial action. It is then inorganic phosphorus that goes back up towards the top of the ocean. As of the hydrologic cycle, water goes up into the air from the ocean through evaporation, and the cloud precipitates and drops that water back down into the ocean. The salt from the ocean is too heavy to be carried back up into the atmosphere through evaporation, so only fresh water is pulled up into the atmosphere. It is basically a cycle of water becoming fresh water as it is dropped, but once it hits the ocean, it becomes salt water again. And that process repeats until the hydrologic cycle, or that section of water, goes over towards land and it gets to go through more plants and animals.